All right, welcome everybody to this lecture on intertextuality in Hebrews 3:1 to 4:13. This is a brief lecture highlighting a few interpretive observations about this section that we are looking at in Hebrews this week. A couple things just as we start. I just want to point out one of the feature, we saw this one in our first section, is this movement in Hebrews between exposition and exhortation. We saw it in the beginning with in chapter 1, Jesus is superior to angels, but then there moves into a warning in chapter 2 that moves a little bit off of the angels theme. It relates to it, but it moves off of it as well. And we're going to see that here in our section where we see, if we look down in our outline, that we have this section about Jesus being superior to Moses, that Moses was a servant, Jesus is a son. But then we move into this larger exhortation, this warning that is related to Moses, but it's also more geared at moving the audience into a new place. So just so we're aware of this, and this is going to happen in Hebrews, that there's going to be this movement between exposition, the argument of Hebrews, and then exhortation. So the movement between, like, moving from the third person, he, she, it is, Jesus is this, to we ought to, you ought to. That's the difference between exposition and exhortation here. So let me make a few comments about this, about the exposition. Oh, before we do that, let me just say this. I wrote here a little bit of what we're looking at when we look at this entire section, and the idea that after Jesus talks about Moses, he's going to then talk about the Exodus generation. And he's particularly going to be interested in the Exodus generation with the episode of the 12 spies. It's going to be kind of the guiding paradigm by which he exhorts the audience that what happens to the Exodus generation at the moment, at the episode of the 12 spies, he does not want that to be the case for them. And he sees them as standing at a very similar spot as the 12 spies and uses the imagery of the 12 spies, particularly in this passage, but also throughout the book. And we're going to look at that. I argue, I also wrote my dissertation on this passage in part, but I see a very clear parallel to Esau, that they have a similar profile, and that is that this group, like Esau, is promised an inheritance. They repudiate it. They refuse to take possession of it. And then they have second thoughts about that. And when they eventually try to take possession of their inheritance, they are rejected or unable to do so. Both of those profiles fit both the Exodus generation and Esau, and we'll look at that. And what that means then is that these people are considered disinherited, and this disinheritance carries a finality that they are not prepared for in this case. So for this section, you've already done, hopefully, or are going to be doing some work in noting some of the intertextuality of the Numbers 13 through 14 and Deuteronomy 1:19 through 46. I'm not going to make too many comments about the intertexts that are going on here. I want you to pay attention to those and do that in your assignment. But let me start in with this idea about Jesus and Moses. As we see here, the exposition section, we move out of chapter 2 and the warning in chapter 2, and we talk about now the author of Hebrews is saying, brothers and sisters, you are partners. You share in a heavenly calling. Jesus is the apostle and high priest of your confession. And then he goes on to compare Jesus with Moses. He compared Jesus with the angels who deliver the law, these divinely sent intermediaries, and now he's going to compare Jesus to an intermediary out of the human ranks, Moses, the greatest of the intermediaries out of the human ranks in the Jewish mind. And so Moses is indeed faithful. He's faithful in God's house, but we're going to see that Jesus is worthy of more glory than Moses. And the argument that he makes is that Moses was in the household of God, but he was a servant. Jesus, however, is, and again, look at what Moses does, considering the revelatory theme of Hebrews, that Moses was a servant and he testified, he bore witness, he revealed things that would be spoken later. But Jesus, as in the household, is a son in the household. And there's a major difference as we think about the the sociological significance of the difference in the first century family between a servant and a son. But Jesus is a son, Moses is a servant. Moses bears witness of certain things, but these things that are going to be spoken later and more clearly by the son, uh, that's what we need to be thinking about. And he makes that argument, obviously, in chapter 1, where in the past God spoke to the fathers through the prophets in many portions and in many ways, but in these last days, he's spoken in a son. And then in chapter 2, he says we've got to pay more attention now to what the son has said. And so again, this comparison between these intermediaries and Jesus is going to be greater than Moses in this section. Now, related to Moses is what Moses was really unable to do with God's people. God's people, as we find out, Moses was unable to take God's people out of slavery and into the promised land. He certainly is part of that process, and he starts that process. But what we find in this quotation of Psalm 95 is that Moses does not take them into the promised land. As a matter of fact, those people don't enter into the promised land. Moses doesn't enter the promised land. Aaron doesn't enter the promised land. Only a couple people from that generation enter into the promised land. But what we're going to find is that Jesus has come and he will bring us into the promised land or rest or to the promised place. He doesn't take us to Mount Sinai. He takes us to the heavenly Mount Zion. So Jesus is going to succeed where Moses failed. And to launch this section out about this failure of Moses and what is essentially Jesus is going to do is he's going to quote from Psalm 95. Now, a couple things about Psalm 95 and the quotation of Psalm 95. This is Psalm 95, verses 7 through 11. But the author is going to quote from Psalm 95 in the Septuagint version, which is Psalm 94. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, Psalm 1 and 2 are conflated together, and they're both Psalm 1. And that sets all of the Psalms off one by one in the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. So as we see, he quotes here, "Today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion." And this is going to be one thing that if you do go back and look at your Old Testament, Psalm 95, it'll probably say something like, "Do not harden your hearts as at Meribah," which is one episode in the book of Numbers. But the word Marah, or Meribah and Marah means rebellion. Meribah is a place. And the Septuagint simply replaces the word Meribah with rebellion, with Marah. And so that's one of the major differences here. And one of the other things that you're going to see, and this is going to be important for the author, is this psalm makes mention of, he says, "Therefore I was angry with this generation." So the psalmist is not concerned that God is angry with all of Israel. He's going to make the point that I'm angry with this generation specifically. And he is going to then he's going to focus on this generation, the Kadesh Barnea Exodus generation that stands at the verge of the promised land, refuses to go in, and then is forced to wander and die in the wilderness. And God says to them, they will certainly not enter into my rest. One interesting thing about the psalm is the psalmist replaces rest with what we find in Numbers 14. God says in Numbers 14, they will certainly not enter into my land. And so land and rest is an interesting juxtaposition in Hebrews. I think it's just another way of saying land, to be honest, that from my perspective, and I argue for that in other places, but that's the quotation. So as we move down into it, and again, this is something we saw earlier when the author of Hebrews quoted from Psalm 8, and then he goes on and he does midrashic interpretation of that psalm. He's going to do the same thing here. So he's going to quote from Psalm 95, and then he's going to do a midrashic interpretation, using various phrases from the psalm to make his point as he moves down. So he goes on to describe this generation, and he's going to compare the audience of Hebrews with this Exodus generation. And he says, "Watch out that there not be in any one of you an evil heart of unbelief." And we're going to find out that the major thing that he is going to fault the Exodus generation with is this lack of faith, no faith. They had no faith and they rebelled. So they had no faith in what God said, and so they rebelled. And we're going to find out that faith is a significant part of what the author of Hebrews is about, especially when we get to chapter 11, where he's going to say, look, it's impossible to please God without faith. And so what we find out from the Exodus generation is that they did not have faith. They have an evil heart of unbelief, of no faith. Instead of pistis or pistia, this is apistia, no faith. And this idea that if you have an evil heart of unbelief, you might depart or fall from the living God, or fall away from the living God, you might see in different translations. And so this idea of no faith produces a falling from the living God. And we're going to see in chapter 6, 4 through 6, if someone does fall away, a very similar word usage here. And so these two, we're going to see that those two warning passages are maybe tied together based on this use of depart or fall away. All right. As we move down here into chapter 3:12, he's going to give this commentary. So he quotes from Psalm 95. He gives an exhortation to the audience in the next 3 verses, and then he goes on to do his midrashic interpretation and this commentary on the failure of the Exodus generation. So he quotes again from Psalm 95:7. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. And then he goes on to ask, well, who was it? Who was it that did this? And he goes on to talk about the specific generation, this generation from the Exodus generation. They were going out from Egypt through Moses. And again, here's our tie into Moses. Moses fails in this. Who was he angry with for 40 years? Those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness. And this is probably an allusion to Numbers 14. You'll have to make that connection in your own study as you're doing the intertextuality exercise. And then he talks about whom did he swear not to go into his rest, except for the ones who were disobedient. And again, no faith and disobedience, those are the major things. They were not able to enter because of, here again, unbelief. So he's tied in, he's already encouraged them, you all have unbelief, because they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. Don't you have no faith, because when they had no faith, they were not able to enter in. So he gives this commentary on the Exodus generation. He returns to this idea of exhortation in 4:1 and this contrast. So here he's going to make a clear contrast between the Exodus generation and the audience. So he says, well, look, let us fear if while a promise to enter his rest is left. And so there's been this promise, a promise to enter into his rest. And one of the things that I argued for in my dissertation is the idea that this idea of inheritance is a theme that is underestimated in the book of Hebrews. And one of the things we see is the verb, probably in your translations and many translations, it'll say something like there remains a promise to enter the rest. This idea that there remains or that it is left. We find that these verbs left or remain are oftentimes used in first century wills, where someone says, I leave you as an inheritance something or someone as an heir. And so these, the cognate group is lepo, apa lepo and kata lepo. But rest is left for them. And I argue that it is as an inheritance, left as an inheritance. But again, this idea that maybe some of you guys are going to fall short. You're going to fall, again, back up here to this idea, you might fall from the living God or depart from the living God. We don't want you to fall short of this. And he's going to say, look, they had good news proclaimed to them. You get to go into the promised land. This is for you. This is your inheritance. And the author is going to say, we've had good news proclaimed to us as well. And he makes mention of that in chapter 2 when he talks about Jesus first spoke it, and then it was proclaimed to us by those who heard, and then it was confirmed by signs and wonders by the Holy Spirit. So if we had this sort of good news preached to us, even as they did, it didn't benefit them. Why did it not benefit them? Because they had no faith. It was not intermingled with faith. So he says, we who do have faith, we're believing, we enter the rest. But he said when they didn't have faith, they did not enter the rest. So that's going to be, again, faith seems to be the significant hinge point and the difference between entering into the rest or the land and not entering into the rest or the land. And that's going to be the major problem that the author is going to hit with his audience. Do you have faith? Are you believing? If you believe what God is saying, then you'll have a shot at entering the rest. But if you don't believe, as God swore in his wrath, they will certainly not enter my rest. So he goes on to talk about this. He quotes Genesis 2:2. God rests on the seventh day. And so there's this idea, there is a rest that is left as an inheritance. There remains for some to enter into rest. The former people, they had good news proclaimed. They didn't enter because, again, no faith and disobedience. Those are the two things, no faith, disobedience. But again, Psalm 95, today if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart, don't go no faith, put your faith in God. And he says, look, Moses didn't give them rest. Joshua did not give them rest. And of course, this is, so Joshua does not, Moses doesn't give it to him. Joshua does lead them into the land, but still they don't ultimately have that rest. And so what we find out for the author says, look, there is still a Sabbath rest for the people of God that has been left as an inheritance for you to enter in. And so the author is saying, it is still out there for you to enter into this ultimate rest. And so let's be diligent. Let's be diligent to enter into that rest and not fall. Again, here's this idea of falling. There's a lot of falling going on in this passage. Don't fall from the living God. Don't fall away. Don't fall short. Don't fall into the same pattern of disobedience. And then this verse, which is very familiar to us, but this verse about the Word of God is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword. It will pierce through and divide. It will judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart, just like it did the Exodus generation. God spoke to them, and they did not hear it, and it ripped through them like a sword, and it divided from soul and spirit. They died. They fell in the wilderness. Their corpses fell in the wilderness. And it judged between the thoughts and intention of their heart. No creature is hidden. All are naked and laid bare before the eyes to the one whom we must render account. And so the author of Hebrews is saying, look, faith and obedience, not faithlessness or unbelief and disobedience, because the Word of God is living and active. It will see through. God's Word will go out. And again, back to this notion of what Jesus is. Jesus is a revelatory word from God. And he has revealed ultimately what God is like and what God wants and what God is looking for. And God has done that in the past in many portions and in many ways, but most recently, he has done it in his Son, and we must pay closer attention to that because this word is sharp and it will pierce you through if you come at it with no faith or with disobedience, just as the author of Hebrews makes mention that the Exodus generation is like that. So hopefully this was helpful and this brought out some of the issues within the text. Certainly you are going to need to get into your commentaries, make your own observations. Particularly what I want you to do is I want you to look at and refamiliarize yourself with the 12 Spies episode because it is so central to how the author of Hebrews sees the audience. He sees them as standing in a very similar spot as them. So enjoy your study this week, and hopefully this was a helpful interpretive observation for you.